Vamos a proceder a la inauguración, que vamos a tratar de que sea breve, aunque hay algunas cosas que es importante decir en una inauguración. Estimadas y estimados estimada y estimados doctor Goodman, doctor Marks, doctora Moses, nuestros distinguidos invitados conferencistas. Do you need translation? You have it, okay. Estimados integrantes del Presidium, doctor Sánchez Menchero, director de este centro del CEIICH de la UNAM, doctor Mauricio Padrón, secretario académico del Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas de la UNAM. Estimadas y estimados colegas, integrantes de SURXE-UNAM, de otras dependencias académicas de nuestra universidad y de otras universidades de México y el mundo. Queridas y queridos estudiantes y personas del público en general. Es un placer y un honor para mí pronunciar las palabras inaugurales de este Coloquio Internacional SURXE 2023 titulado Voces antirracistas no racialistas en los Estados Unidos. Resulta muy importante para SURXE reflexionar hoy en día acerca de la indispensable y urgente construcción de caminos que puedan conducirnos a horizontes liberados o lo más liberados posible del racismo, uno de los más agresivos sistemas estructurales de deshumanización e inferiorización de la historia de nuestra especie y que está desgraciadamente lejos de llegar a su fin. A lo largo de casi 3 siglos, las sociedades humanas han estructurado parte de las relaciones que se dan en su interior sobre la base de la convicción de que los seres humanos estamos divididos en razas. Esto, que se conoce como racialización, ha permeado nuestras miradas sobre nosotros mismos y sobre los otros. De manera arbitraria, el pensamiento racista le ha conferido a cada grupo humano ciertos rasgos raciales a los que viste de una supuesta objetividad y que se ha dicho por mucho tiempo rasgos raciales de carácter biológico, a los que viste entonces aún más de una supuesta objetividad, a los que confiere un carácter de verdad con V mayúscula y que en su mirada explican cabalmente lo que hace que cada llamada raza sea esencialmente diferente de las demás y superior o inferior a ellas. Esto es lo que se conoce como racialismo, o por lo menos lo definimos aquí así, porque sabemos que también hay polisemia en las definiciones. La racialización es el campo de cultivo del racismo y el racialismo es intrínseco al racismo. Actualmente, dentro del campo de las ciencias de la vida, hay un consenso cada vez más extendido en el sentido de que, contrariamente a lo que se creyó por mucho tiempo, la raza no tiene fundamento biológico alguno. Este consenso gana adeptos, cada vez más adeptos, dentro del campo de las ciencias sociales y las humanidades y en el movimiento antirracista, desde cuyas trincheras se escucha cotidianamente que las razas no son entes biológicos o genéticos, sino construcciones sociales y culturales. A pesar de ello, el concepto raza sigue vigente y se expresa en muchas nociones que impregnan las creencias y los sentimientos cotidianos, el discurso popular, el lenguaje de los medios de comunicación, la política pública, la reflexión académica e incluso el activismo políticamente correcto. En otras palabras, muchas voces no logran escapar del laberinto del racialismo. Es decir, que si bien pretenden con toda honestidad contribuir a combatir el racismo, siguen concibiendo a las razas como vestidas de un cierto carácter de verdad. Sostienen que las razas son nichos objetivos de pertenencia y de identidad social y política y arguyen que esta forma racialista de seguir objetivando tanto el concepto raza como a las razas humanas tiene lo que se requiere para dinamitar la ideología, la cultura y las prácticas del racismo y avanzar hacia sociedades menos racistas. Ahora comentaba yo con nuestros invitados que obviamente hay países en donde la raza es una categoría política de lucha absolutamente reconocida, ¿no? Y que no se puede llegar a esos países a decir, por ejemplo, en Estados Unidos, a decirle al movimiento negro que no se autonombre como raza negra, ¿no? O decirle al movimiento negro en Brasil que no se autonombre como raza negra, ¿no? Pero hay países donde eso no ocurre, donde el movimiento de lucha por los derechos de clase, digamos, desde el punto de vista de clase, étnico o contra el racismo, no hace lo mismo. Y México es uno de esos países. Por lo tanto, lo que estoy diciendo tiene mucho que ver con lo que ocurre también o en parte en este país. Otras voces dentro del amplio campo antirracista sostienen que el antirracismo debería ser todo menos racialista, porque al serlo reproduce las bases epistemológicas del pensamiento racial, lo que conduce a que su propuesta y su lucha no logren quebrar la ideología, la cultura y las prácticas del racismo. Son estas últimas voces las que se expresarán de cierta manera, y yo sé que cada uno de ustedes lo hará desde distintas perspectivas y con sus propias voces que no sé si comulguen totalmente con lo que estoy diciendo, en este coloquio. Y lo harán en la persona de tres muy connotados académicos que viven y trabajan en los Estados Unidos. La doctora Yolanda Moses, nuestros invitados van a ser presentados de manera individual antes de cada conferencia que les corresponde por Francisco Vergara aquí presente, pero voy a hacer una presentación muy breve de los tres en este momento. La doctora Yolanda Moses, quien entre 2003 y la actualidad ha sido profesora de antropología en la Universidad de California en Riverside, y entre el 2007 y el 2017 fue la vicerrectora asociada de diversidad, equidad y excelencia de dicha universidad. La investigación de la doctora Moses se ha centrado en la cuestión de los orígenes y la sostenibilidad de los sistemas y las prácticas de desigualdad social en sociedades complejas, utilizando métodos comparativos, etnográficos y de encuestas. Ella también ha explorado las disparidades de género y de clase en el Caribe, África Oriental y Estados Unidos. Sus recientes investigaciones se han centrado en temas de diversidad y cambio en universidades y colegios de Estados Unidos, la India, Europa, Australia y Sudáfrica. El doctor Alan Goodman, quien es profesor de antropología biológica en el Hampshire College en Amherst, Massachusetts, y su investigación se centra en cómo la pobreza, la desigualdad y el racismo se insertan dentro de la piel. Él ha mostrado siempre un gran interés político y científico acerca de cómo la raza se cosificó, fue convertida en algo real y todavía se usa con frecuencia como si fuera una realidad natural en lugar de una idea cosificada para justificar el racismo. El doctor Goodman fue decano del Hampshire College y presidente de la American Anthropological Association, que cuenta con más de 11,000 miembros y es la organización profesional de antropólogos más grande del mundo, en cuyo seno sigue codirigiendo el proyecto de educación pública sobre la raza. Y finalmente el doctor Jonathan Marks, quien a partir de 2000 ha sido profesor de antropología en la Universidad de Carolina del Norte en Charlotte, cuya formación principal es en antropología biológica y genética, pero que ha acumulado conocimientos muy amplios provenientes de otros horizontes disciplinarios. El doctor Marks cuenta con numerosas publicaciones, bueno, nuestros tres invitados con numerosas publicaciones en ciencias y humanidades sobre temas generales que tienen que ver con los orígenes y la diversidad humana. Ha recibido múltiples reconocimientos, todos nuestros invitados también, y en 2006 fue elegido miembro de la Asociación Estadounidense para el Avance de la Ciencia. Tres son las razones por las cuales SURXE decidió que nuestro Coloquio Internacional 2023 versara sobre estos temas, particularmente en los Estados Unidos. Y estas razones están estrechamente relacionadas entre sí. La primera es que históricamente hablando, la sociedad, las instituciones, la academia y el movimiento antirracista en nuestro vecino país del norte han sido básica y fuertemente racialistas. Precisamente por ello es crucial, esta es la segunda razón, que importantes voces estadounidenses especialistas en racismo y claramente antirracistas nos expliquen por qué sostienen que para poder ser mucho más eficaces en el combate en contra de este peligroso fenómeno sistémico, es indispensable hacerlo no solo en el seno de su país, sino en el mundo, desde posturas antirracialistas construidas a partir de argumentos muy sólidos. Y tercero, actualmente en el pensamiento y en el movimiento antirracista que se desarrolla dentro de México y de algunos otros países latinoamericanos, resulta fundamental introducir de manera seria el debate acerca de qué tan conveniente o no, pertinente o no y políticamente eficaz o no resulta empujar en nuestros países agendas antirracistas racialistas. Este evento ha sido posible gracias a un apoyo interinstitucional interno a la UNAM, en el que participaron el CEIICH, el Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas, el Instituto de Investigaciones Antropológicas, cuya directora no pudo venir hoy y se disculpa, pero nos manda saludos, y el Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales, lo mismo, Miguel Armando López Leiva, el director, no le fue posible venir, pero manda saludos. Y agradezco muchísimo en nombre de SURXE este apoyo. Quiero agradecer también al doctor Francisco Vergara el haber aceptado fungir como moderador a lo largo de todo el coloquio. Presento brevemente al doctor Vergara. Él es doctor en ciencias por la UNAM, actualmente es investigador titular del Instituto de Biología de nuestra universidad e investigador nacional SNI 2. Se especializa en estudios históricos, filosóficos y sociológicos de la biología, en particular en sus interacciones disciplinarias con la antropología. Por ejemplo, en el contexto de la antropología biológica y la etnobiología. Ha publicado más de 70 trabajos académicos, de los cuales más de 45 en revistas arbitradas internacionales. Pertenece a varias asociaciones profesionales, entre las cuales la AAA, la American Anthropological Association. Fue parte del comité fundador de Integra, de la que nos hablará mucho el doctor Sánchez Menchero, y también es un muy activo integrante de SURXE, del que también nos hablará Mauricio. Asimismo, quiero extender mi agradecimiento a todo el equipo del doctor Sánchez Menchero en el CEIICH, en particular su secretaria particular Ruth, las diseñadoras gráficas y editoriales del Departamento de Publicaciones, quienes trabajan en el Departamento de Difusión y en el Departamento, allá están los compañeros de producción audiovisual y multimedia de este centro, que entre otras cosas garantizará la transmisión vía YouTube en el canal del CEIICH. Ahora Víctor nos dirá cuánta gente está conectada. Y Facebook, vía YouTube y Facebook. Y bueno, gracias por su profesionalismo y buena disposición. Finalmente, y esto no lo puedo decir en español, last but not least, quiero agradecer muy, muy especialmente a la maestra Jimena Rodríguez Pavón, secretaria técnica de SURXE, que nos ha básicamente organizado todo este evento. Sin su siempre excelente trabajo y compromiso, este evento no habría sido de ninguna manera posible. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias. Buenas tardes a todas y todos. Voy a ser muy breve. En nombre de la doctora Mónica González Contró, directora del Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas, los saluda. No pude estar aquí por otro compromiso. Quiero agradecer, por supuesto, a Jimena, a Olivia, Mauricio también, muchas gracias por recibirme el día de hoy. Y a mí me da mucho gusto, igual que a Mónica, a la doctora González Contró, porque no solo es un compromiso del instituto con el tema y con el seminario, sino que también es un compromiso personal que tenemos tanto Mónica como yo. Les cuento brevemente, Mónica y yo coordinamos un diplomado sobre el derecho a la no discriminación en el Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas. Olivia es parte de los docentes de ese diplomado, es un diplomado que va por la edición número 18, entonces conocemos bastante de cerca de lo que están hablando, lo que van a hablar el día de hoy y lo que hablan y lo que se discute en el seminario. Por eso el compromiso es doble, es un compromiso institucional, pero también es un compromiso personal. El apoyo que les dio el instituto, en la medida de nuestras posibilidades en este momento, tiene que ver con eso. Justo el instituto tiene una larga tradición en la investigación en temas vinculados a la discriminación, a la exclusión, por supuesto desde la mirada jurídica. El tema del racismo, de la xenofobia, no es un tema ajeno a la investigación que hace el instituto. De hecho, hoy en la mañana me tocó inaugurar también en el instituto las Jornadas Lacasianas, la edición número 29 de las Jornadas Lacasianas, que si bien se centra en los pueblos originarios, en los pueblos indígenas, tiene todo que ver con el tema que aborda tanto el seminario como se va a abordar el día de hoy. Yo pensaba, y lo comentaba un poco en la mañana, resulta quizá a veces un poco común encontrar con la gente con la que relacionamos que dicen México no es un país racista, México no es un país que discrimina. Y cuando uno, por ejemplo, mira datos, ¿no?, de las encuestas, la encuesta nacional de discriminación del año pasado, del 2022, sigue mostrando los datos que no han cambiado básicamente en las últimas décadas, ¿no? Tenemos que el 25% de la población, más o menos, se ha sentido discriminada en algún momento en el último año de la medición. Cuando se le pregunta eso a la población afrodescendiente, ese porcentaje del 25% aumenta al 38%. Es decir, sí tenemos un problema. Sí hay un problema que hay que atacar. Hay que discutir teóricamente, hay que discutir conceptualmente, esto que Olivia mencionaba, el tema de la polisemia, luego de los conceptos, es una cosa que nosotros como academia estamos obligados a hacer, es parte de lo que nos toca desde la trinchera en la que estamos, pero eso impacta directamente sobre las cuestiones jurídicas, por ejemplo, que es el tema del instituto al que yo pertenezco. Entonces es importante que discutamos, que sigamos discutiendo estas cuestiones, que sigan estando en la mesa de discusión y por eso agradezco y felicito al seminario, a Olivia, por seguir trabajando estos temas, por seguir defendiendo que estos temas tienen que estar presentes en la academia, por supuesto al CEIICH, por también tener el seminario, este seminario en sus instalaciones. Y no me queda más que agradecer a los ponentes, a los conferencistas, gracias por estar aquí y agradecerles a ustedes y todo el éxito, no solo en este coloquio, sino en lo que venga adelante en el seminario. Gracias.
Pues muy buenas tardes tengan todas y todos los aquí presentes y también a distancia, los que nos siguen en las plataformas de YouTube y Facebook. Sean todos bienvenidos a este Centro de Investigaciones Interdisciplinarias en Ciencias y Humanidades de la UNAM. Y quiero agradecer en primer término en esta tarde lluviosa que está afectando en el ciclón en Acapulco y que por cierto ya tenemos dispuesto en el estadio de CEU aquí enfrente para poder brindar ayuda a acopio desde el día de mañana. A primera hora ya estarán dispuestos porque la afectación del ciclón pues en nivel 5, hace mucho que no teníamos este accidente. Bueno, agradezco en primer término la presencia de la doctora Olivia Gall, coordinadora del programa de este seminario universitario interdisciplinario sobre racismo y xenofobia, SURXE. También agradezco la presencia del doctor Mauricio Padrón, secretario académico del Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas. También no puedo dejar de saludar y agradecer el trabajo de la maestra Jimena Rodríguez Pavón por su trabajo esmerado, ya lo dijo Olivia Gall, siempre está aquí al pie del cañón. No sé cómo lo vayan a traducir esto al inglés, pero bueno, ahí se los dejo. Les doy la más cordial bienvenida a nuestros conferencistas, a dos de ellos aquí presentes, Jonathan Marx y Yolanda Moses. Muchas gracias por su presencia, estaremos muy pendientes de sus palabras. Y quiero comenzar con estas palabras de inauguración, trayendo a la memoria al actor estadounidense Richard Roundtree, quien falleció este martes a sus 81 años de edad en Los Ángeles, California, y cuya actuación recordarán algunos de los que ya tenemos más edad, la película Shaft, que por cierto, inaugura, y va a inaugurar, es nuestra primera película en estos ciclos que tenemos de historia y cine, los afroamericanos y su autorrepresentación cinematográfica a partir del próximo mes de noviembre. Justo en esta cinta de 1971, Richard Roundtree ayudó a redefinir la masculinidad afroamericana, hoy ya rebasada, hoy sería también la feminidad, pero viene con una nueva ola de producción cinematográfica en manos de afroamericanos. Richard Roundtree interpretó este papel de Shaft, uno de los primeros héroes de acción afroamericanos en pantallas grandes. En una entrevista, el propio actor reconocía que su actuación mostraba, y cito, a un hombre negro que por primera vez es un ganador, en 1970. No es mi propósito extenderme sobre lo que significó esta película y la actuación de Roundtree, pero quiero recordar solamente dos elementos de reconstrucción y empoderamiento visual que logró manifestarse en Shaft. Me refiero al tema musical, desde luego, escrito e interpretado por Isaac Hayes, que ganó el premio de la Academia de 1972 a la mejor canción original. Y la verdad que sigue siendo, lo estuve escuchando este fin de semana, impactante la canción. Pero sobre todo me refiero a la retadora lente cinematográfica urbana del realizador Gordon Parks, que supo enfocar en el contexto de la lucha por los derechos civiles en Estados Unidos vigente en ese momento, el cuestionamiento del color de la piel, como un elemento en la construcción simbólica al retratar a su protagonista central caminando por las calles de Nueva York y que interroga el valor del color de la piel, cuestionando el racionalismo en la escena en particular, donde se compara en un medium close-up, hay un acercamiento de esta lente, y está Shaft con una taza bebiendo café y lo compara con el blanco del jefe de policía. Y se lo regresa porque anteriormente el policía le estaba diciendo es que tú eres un negro, y él le pone la taza de color blanco y lo compara como un pantone. Un tema apasionante que será tema de reflexión gracias a ustedes, a las personas que nos van a hablar, los conferencistas en este coloquio, que desde luego son figuras muy reconocidas del pensamiento académico, ya lo dijo Olivia Gall. Pero debo reconocer que gracias a este seminario universitario interdisciplinario sobre racismo y xenofobia SURXE, se cuenta con un espacio institucional en la UNAM dedicado a la investigación, difusión, divulgación y extensión universitaria en torno a los temas de racismo y xenofobia, así como para la incidencia social y política en la lucha antirracista y antisxenófoba en México y en el mundo. Quizás algunos de ustedes saben que el antecedente de SURXE fue la Red Integra, una de las redes temáticas de investigación del antiguo CONACYT, ahora ya no, ahora es CONACHE, que entre 2014 y 2018 trabajó en la visibilización, teorización y combate al racismo y a la xenofobia en México y en América Latina. La red se compuso de más de 150 investigadores, docentes, estudiantes y activistas que en 16 estados del país que supieron impulsar la agenda de visibilización de estos fenómenos y su incidencia en la cotidianidad. Esto nos habla ya de una amplia trayectoria de trabajo académico en el tema del racismo y la xenofobia, que es hoy en día una temática que se discute ampliamente en la academia, la sociedad y los medios de comunicación, pero esto no sucedía así hace una década. El trabajo de la Red Integra y de SURXE ha permitido evidenciar y combatir el racismo y la xenofobia que estructuralmente, insertos en las relaciones de poder, provocan diversos grados de discriminación, marginación, inferiorización y exclusión en las vidas de varios y diversos grupos humanos y obstaculizan su acceso a la igualdad de oportunidad y al disfrute de sus derechos humanos fundamentales. Aunque SURXE es parte de la Secretaría de Desarrollo Institucional de la UNAM, cuyas oficinas están aquí enfrente, ¿en qué piso es? El octavo. SURXE ha tenido su casa académica en el CEIICH. De hecho, las gestiones para la creación de SURXE se realizaron y se impulsaron desde este centro, cuyas oficinas están en el quinto piso, aquí arribita. A lo largo de estos 4 años hemos alojado e impulsado desde el CEIICH diversas actividades académicas de SURXE, muchas de las cuales han tenido continuidad a lo largo del tiempo. Este es el caso, y menciono nada más algunos, el diplomado en línea, Racismo y Xenofobia vistos desde México, bajo la dirección de la doctora Olivia Gall y la doctora Eugenia Iturriaga de SURGE y de la Universidad de Yucatán, con 11 promociones. El Seminario Permanente de Antropología e Historia de los Racismos, las Discriminaciones y las Desigualdades, actualmente que se coorganiza con el INA y SURGE y desde luego nosotros, y coordinado por la doctora Cristina Mansferrer y la maestra Jimena Rodríguez. O el ciclo de conversaciones sobre raza, racismo y antropología biológica, coordinado por el doctor Francisco Vergara, del Instituto de Biología de la UNAM y SURGE. La materia transversal que SURGE imparte como colectivo a las 13 carreras de licenciatura de la Escuela Nacional de Estudios Superiores de Morelia de la UNAM sobre racismos y xenofobias también es otra tarea fundamental que ha llevado a cabo este seminario. Todos estos han sido espacios para conocer las distintas aristas del complejo fenómeno del racismo, para debatir, formar a estudiantes y público en general, así como, por supuesto, buscar conjuntamente posibilidades, espacios de desarticulación del racismo en este país y en nuestra propia universidad. Por todo lo anterior, resulta más que importante seguir apoyando las actividades de SURGE, como este coloquio, del cual estaré pendiente de las conferencias que escucharé, ni modo, de manera diferida, porque mis obligaciones no me lo permiten de momento. Mucha suerte y gracias de nuevo por su trabajo. Y ya sin mayores preámbulos, damos por inaugurado el Coloquio Internacional SURGE de la UNAM, Voces antirracistas, no racialistas de Estados Unidos, siendo las 16:53 del 25 de octubre del 2023. Mucho éxito.
Pues muchísimas gracias a Mauricio y a Mauricio por participar en esta inauguración. Voy a invitar ahora a nuestro ponente, el doctor Jonathan Marks, a que suba aquí al presidium, y también al doctor Francisco Vergara, quien va a moderar. Y le quisiera preguntar a Víctor cuánta gente está conectada en Facebook y en YouTube, si nos puede decir.
También por las palabras de las autoridades de los institutos que participan como en el auspicio de este evento. Y pues sin más, continuando un poco con la presentación que ya comenzó Olivia del profesor Jonathan Marks, voy a mencionar algunas otras cuestiones de índole biográfica para darle, sobre todo porque vamos un poco tarde, ya la palabra a John. El trabajo del profesor Marks ha sido publicado en revistas académicas que van desde American Anthropologist hasta Saigon, de la A a la Z. En 2006 fue elegido miembro de la Asociación Estadounidense para el Avance de la Ciencia, me parece que esto ya lo había mencionado Olivia. En 2012 recibió la First Citizens Bank Scholars Medal de su universidad, la Universidad de Carolina del Norte en Charlotte, y en los últimos años ha sido investigador visitante en el ESRC Genomics Forum en Edimburgo, Escocia, también en el Instituto Max Planck de Historia de la Ciencia en Berlín, también ha sido Templeton Fellow en el Instituto de Estudios Avanzados en Notre Dame, y su trabajo académico ha recibido el W. Howells Book Prize y el General Anthropology Division Prize for Exemplary Crossfield Scholarship de la AAA. También el premio J.I. Staley de la School for Advanced Research. Sus libros más recientes son Is Science Racist, publicado por Polity Press en 2017. Why Are There Still Creationists, también por Polity en 2021. Understanding Human Diversity, que está en prensa en Cambridge University Press. Y de hecho, ahí lo traemos, la segunda edición al menos, ¿no?, de 2018, me parece, de The Alternative Introduction to Biological Anthropology, que nos dio mucho gusto saber que es un libro que se está usando ya en la Escuela Nacional de Antropología e Historia como un libro de texto para los primeros semestres, y creo que eso le dio mucho gusto a John. Entonces, bueno, sin más, muchísimas gracias, John, por estar aquí. Te escuchamos.
All right, well, let me begin by thanking the organizers for the invitation to come out and speak today, and for the opportunity to listen to my friends and colleagues. Okay. My last visit here to UNAM was for the Darwin Bicentennial back in 2009, and I had a great time, so thanks for that one, and thanks for this one. Okay. Okay. Tengo 80. Okay. So the field that I work in, biological anthropology, has made two big discoveries. In the 19th century, we discovered that we are descended from apes. That was a good one. And it took a while to sink in. It still hasn't sunk in to some people. And in the 20th century, we discovered that race and human variation are very different things. Arguably an even better discovery, and still resisted among a different group of anti-science activists. Now, as it turns out, the last time I visited, back in 2009, we were talking about the big 19th century idea in biological anthropology. And so today, it's a pleasure to talk about the 20th century idea. Because there's a lot of historical literature on the transformation within the scientific community in the wake of demystifying human origins, but not so much on the transformation of the scientific community in the wake of demystifying human diversity, which is something that all of the speakers here actually lived through and worked through. Here are a couple of recent books, on the left by a couple of historians, on the right by a journalist, which explore the issue of not so much what do we think of human diversity, but how did we come to this point of thinking this way about it? And it's a question that interests me, again, not just because I lived through it, but simply as a professional biological anthropologist, I'm interested in the empirical patterns by which our species appears to vary. Yet also, as an amateur historian of science, I'm interested not just in what we think now, but also in what we used to think, why we thought it then, and why we don't think it anymore. The idea of race is fascinating from the standpoint of the history of science, since it represents 200 years of the scientific literature being wrong, and scientists seeing something that isn't actually there. How did something like that happen? Well, it turns out to be quite normal. The human mind is especially good at perceiving patterns. And if the patterns aren't actually there, the human mind is very good at making them up. The most popular things for the human mind to make up is faces. The ancient Greeks had a word for this, pareidolia, imagining facial patterns. The taxonomic division of the human species is like the face of Jesus in a tortilla. or the angry bell peppers, the back of the computer, the smiling lock, or the upside-down shark. Another thing that the human mind seems to be good at is classifying. Since classification is fundamentally a linguistic process, it seems directly related to our unique evolutionary adaptations for communication. In other words, classifying is part of our nature. And European minds, in particular, have a long tradition of looking to nature to understand the mind of God. So the question of race boils down to scientists being fooled by the goal of trying to find a natural classification of people, assuming that there is one there to be found. And of course, the harder you look for it, the easier it is to convince yourself that you found it, especially when you know it's supposed to be there. In this case, the idea of race, that is to say, the idea that the human species is naturally divisible into a fairly small number of fairly discrete types of people, arose in the 1600s and 1700s with the convergence of the beginnings of modern science and the height of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, prior to that time, human diversity had been recognized, but generally understood to be patterned locally. Certainly, the ancient Greeks recognized that the people north of them and the people south of them looked a bit different. But like other cultures, they recognized each particular group of people as having their own peculiarities, physical, behavioral, aesthetic. That's certainly how the ancient Greek Herodotus wrote about the world. But something changed in the perceptions of humanity on the part of European scholars in the 1600s, driven by shipping and slavery. They began to collapse a lot of what had previously been diversity into large groups of homogeneity. We often credit a French physician and explorer named François Bernier with the invention of racial classification. Bernier's 1684 paper did indeed divide the peoples of the world into 5 or 6 species or races, which were more or less synonymous in 1684, but he did not do so continentally. Africans, for example, were divided 3 ways: North Africans with Europeans, Sub-Saharan Africans separately from them, and the Khoisan separate from both of those. He also believed that the Sami in Scandinavia were their own race, and Native Americans were just variant Europeans. So this is certainly one strand of the origin of the theory of race. But the one that had the most impact was the idea that each continent has its own kind of person. We lay this idea at the feet of the founder of biological taxonomy, the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus. By 1735, in his first edition of System of Nature, he already divides us up into 4 continentally based groups. Interestingly, at this early stage, Linnaeus has them as species: Homo europaeus, Homo americanus, Homo asiaticus, and Homo africanus, and each one color-coded for your convenience as whitish, reddish, brown, and blackish. His 1758 10th edition is the official starting point of modern biological taxonomy. And there are some important differences over those 23 years. These are all now subspecies or varieties of a single species, which he calls Homo sapiens. He reverses the positions of Americans and Europeans. We don't know why. And gives them official colors: red, white, yellow, black. And he recolors Asians from brown to yellow. Now, this is quite different from the classification of Bernier some decades earlier. This is a 4-fold division of the human species that maps onto the continents. He sees it, notably, as a macrocosm of the human body, which was still understood in Hippocratic terms in the middle of the 18th century, in terms of a balance of 4 fluids or humors within the body. And here, representing the human body, the human species is composed of 4 kinds of people, dominated by chole, sanguis, melancholy, and phlegma, the 4 humors. And Linnaeus goes all in on the 4-fold continental division of the human species. Indeed, he gave the 4 continents different personalities, different modes of dress, and different legal systems. In fact, Linnaeus was so taken by quartering the human species that, as the historian Staffan Müller-Wille has shown, in Linnaeus's unpublished papers, he maps the 4 peoples of the world onto the 4 drinks of the world. Let's see, come on. With Americans, come on, there we go. Americans drinking chocolate, Africans drinking coffee, Asians drinking tea, and Europeans drinking beer. It's a real shame he never published that. But of course, Linnaeus didn't get his ideas out of nowhere. We lay this continental division at his feet, but he didn't just dream it up himself one day. Linnaeus's contribution very specifically was to make this science. And what I want to talk about briefly now is how this idea was out there prior to Linnaeus, but it wasn't science. The idea of 4 kinds of people populating 4 land masses was imported into science by Linnaeus and transformed into science. But transformed from what? To answer that question, we have to become biblical scholars for just a little bit, as well as anthropologists, and recognize that in ancient times, there was a close relationship between residence and descent, where you come from geographically and where you come from genealogically. That relationship was so intimate that it was often mythologized. Noah is sent on a boat to save animal life from extinction, and he succeeds, eventually landing on the mountains of Ararat. He has 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, about whom more shortly. But for the time being, let's just focus on his son Ham. Ham has sons, Noah's grandsons, Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan, according to this particular English translation of the Bible. But of course, those were also understood to be places. These are mythic founders of the Egyptians, the Canaanites, etc., at least in the understanding of the ancient Hebrews. Let's return to the generation above them, Noah's 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. By Hellenistic times, these 3 sons were crudely understood to map onto the 3 known continents. And by medieval times, this was often represented symbolically as a TO map of the world. Hopefully you can see the T and the O. East is at the top as Asia, populated by the descendants of Shem. Europe is founded by Japheth and Africa by Ham, and at the center of everything is Jerusalem. It makes a bit more sense if we rotate it 90 degrees. Europe is in the northwest, above Africa, and separated by the sea in the middle of the world, the Mediterranean, and in the east is Asia, which is separated by a sort of imaginary body of water composed of the Black Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Red Sea. Well, here's a later version of this kind of map. Noah's Ark is at the top, and the 3 sons each have a continent. Of course, they don't look very different from one another. After all, they're brothers. Moreover, this is obviously not a navigational map. This is an explanatory map. It is not going to get you from point A to point B, but rather it helps you understand the world. And this equivalence of continent and its founder patriarch can work fine, unless you find another continent. And of course, that's exactly what happened. So here's a map from just after the discovery of something in the lower left there, America, the New World. And in this version of the TO map, you have Jerusalem in the middle, Europe, Asia, and Africa. But what's missing is Noah's Ark and the three sons. Why? Because we now have a fourth continent, but still only three sons. So we will need a new metaphor to make sense of the land masses. Noah's three sons is now inadequate. But as luck would have it, there is another metaphor out there for the four continents that can easily be appropriated, namely, naked women. This is from the late 1500s, and you're looking at an artistic representation of Africa by a Dutch engraver, and it is loaded with symbolism. Africa's chariot is drawn by lions. She's also got a pet crocodile and some elephants in the background. That is her menagerie. America, also uncovered, rides in a chariot drawn by unicorns. She has a feather headdress and a bow and arrow and a pet armadillo. Asia, by contrast, is covered up, modesty perhaps symbolizing civilization. Her chariot is drawn by camels, and she waves incense representing the Eastern Church. And finally, Europe rides a chariot drawn by horses. She holds an orb and scepter symbolizing power, and there are bulls in the background, which is the form in which Zeus came to Europa in order to rape her. But the most interesting thing about these four women in the present context is that they are not racialized. They all look like Europe. And that is because the women are symbolizing the continents and not the people on the continents. Here's a nice one from 1581, a book about fashions around the world. And on the front page, the artist shows us the continents. Asia, modestly dressed, camel on a pedestal, and waving her incense. America, feather headdress, bow and arrow, and a pet chihuahua. Third, Europe and her bull, a bit kinky, but clothed. And finally, Africa, naked with an elephant. Now, obviously, this is far from value neutral. However, aside from the implication of civilization in the presence or absence of clothing, there's nothing about these women that ostensibly represents the people on the continents. These women represent the land masses, and that is certainly clear when you look at their faces. These women are not racialized. Facially, they're all the same. Why? Because the symbolic work they are doing is essentially to replace Ham, Shem, and Japheth as a sort of symbolic explanation of the world. Like Ham, Shem, and Japheth, they look like siblings, but unlike them, they're not ancestors and not biblical. They're visual art. By the early 1600s, this allegorical representation of the continents had become so familiar that they were included in this book on how to represent things in art, Cesare Ripa's Iconology. And he shows us Europe wearing a crown, holding a church, with a horn of plenty and riding a horse. Asia sports a garland wreath, waves her religious incense, and has a pet camel. Africa has a lion and a scorpion and wears an elephant hat. And savage America with bow and arrows and a feather headdress and an alligator. The point being, if you want to draw the continents symbolically, here is how you do it. Ripa specifies in the text that Africa is dark and has frizzy hair. So he's ahead of the racial curve. And America is yellowish, interestingly not red, But you can't see any of that from the illustrations, which first appear in editions several years after the text was published. My point is that there's no reason for the figures of the women to look different from one another, because the figures are specifically representing geology, not anthropology. And over the course of the 1600s, artists working with map makers need to fill up the corners of their maps, and sometimes they do it with the 4 winds, or the 4 seasons, or the 4 elements. But since, after all, this is a map, they commonly do the 4 continents, and they follow the artistic traditions literally mapped out here. Now remember, our friend Linnaeus and his Systema Naturae are 100 years in the future. So from 1657, this Dutch map of the world shows us Europe with her crown and her bull and her horn of plenty. Asia waving her incense and astride a camel. America bare-breasted, feather headdress, bow and arrow, armadillo. And Africa also bare-breasted and riding a crocodile. The key once again being that these are not racialized images representing people, but non-racialized images, or at least European-looking images representing land masses. But this is now the height of the slave trade, and women begin to pull double symbolic duty. In this map from 1714, there's, this map. Voila. There's America at the upper left, bare-breasted, feather headdress. In the upper right, there's Europe, horn of plenty, crown. At the lower left is Asia, incense, and they all look alike. But in the lower right is Africa, looking just a little bit different. She is starting to symbolize not just Africa, but Africans as well, as Cesare Ripa had specified in his art book from over 100 years earlier. There we go. In this colored lithograph from 1720, very similar in style. Europe with her crown, America with her feather headdress, Asia with her incense, and Africa with her lion, but also looking a little bit different from everybody else. And as long as we are othering the Africans, we have some latitude with coloring. And in this one from back in 1636, Europe and Asia look pretty much the same. But Africa is othered by color, and America is differently othered by color. The point of all this being that the idea of 4 distinct land masses being occupied by 4 distinct kinds of people began as a map-making allegory and evolved into a racial theory over the course of the 1600s in European art. Linnaeus, bless his heart, as we say in North Carolina, took what was common artistic license and transformed it into scientific knowledge. When Linnaeus formalizes for the first time the zoological distinction of people on the 4 known land masses, it was old news culturally. It just wasn't science yet. He made it science, and it remained science for the next 200 years. The contrast of black and white was obviously commonsensical from the political economics of slavery. We don't know how Linnaeus settled on red for Native Americans, although by the early 1700s, the distinction in the Eastern American colonies between red and white was commonplace. And yellow was a color associated with the most familiar Asians, namely the Jews. But I'm less interested in the color palette than in the scientific theory, by which each continent is entitled to a single kind of person distinct from the other continents, which is rather different than the earlier ideas of simply fictive descent groups based on the sons of Noah. Now, Linnaeus didn't call these divisions of the human species races. He called them varieties, and made them formally equivalent to subspecies. The next 250 years of thought on the subject involved dividing the human species up based on geography, head shape, nationality, blood groups, language, religion, ethnic label, body build, hair form, nose form, and eventually pretending over the course of the 19th century that these were all somehow naturalistic, discrete categories. And then, of course, it took the 20th century to disentangle them. And most significantly, it will be the development in the 19th century of a new metaphor to understand human diversity, after the sons of Noah and the bodies of women. And that metaphor will be provided by the German embryologist and early Darwinian Ernst Haeckel. Namely, the branches of a tree. This is the first depiction of an evolutionary tree in the literature by Haeckel in 1874. Biologists like to admire it as the very first evolutionary tree that links us visually to the chimp, gorilla, orangutan, and gibbon. What they don't call attention to is the cost of this visual image, which will become clearer when we focus on just the middle part. And that is the idea that the human species itself consists of discrete, diverging branches, just like the higher taxa. The metaphor that replaced women as the avatars of the human inhabitants of different regions of the world was the branches of a tree. This fit very nicely into the racial mindset, and unfortunately still does. But empirical students of human variation in the 20th century, even the ones who were most professionally interested in race, immediately recognized the limitations of the tree metaphor. Harvard's physical anthropologist Ernest Houghton invoked the circulatory system, in which branches don't merely diverge, but also merge to form a connected reticulating network, not like the branches of a tree, but more like its root system. He labeled this illustration literally bloodstreams of the human races. Even Houghton, however, also presented the human races as a Darwinian tree. Consistency was not one of Houghton's scientific qualities. Nevertheless, other scholars suggested the metaphor of a train trellis, notably the anatomist Franz Weidenreich, again imagining the human species not as divergent tree branches, but as complex lineages. The metaphor of choice today among many biological anthropologists is Rebecca Ackerman's idea of a braided stream or river delta. And believe me, if I had a selfie with Franz Weidenreich, I would have shown it too. None of these metaphors, however, has the power of the Darwinian tree, even if they do represent our biological history far more accurately. There simply isn't a natural way to divide up the species that results in reasonably homogeneous groups that differ fundamentally from one another, as race had designated in science for a couple of centuries. Now, I'd like to spend a few minutes on the idea of the tree of races. Foliage, as a general metaphor of descent, was fairly old news. What's new is the presumed literalness of this particular tree of descent. Haeckel published the first tree of the descent of human races, but he got the idea from somewhere, and that somewhere was his colleague, the linguist August Schleicher. He is the one we credit with the first anthropological tree of descent, namely of languages, just 4 years after the origin of species. In fact, Schleicher's pamphlet is dedicated to his colleague Haeckel. And notice that his tree of languages is a tree of divergence, with no merging. It's an evolutionary process with descent and divergence and nothing else. Your language is not affected by your neighbor's languages, but only by your ancestor's language. And that is a very powerful, if false, model of cultural historical processes. And it will become a powerful and false model of human biological microevolution as applied by Haeckel. The branching evolutionary tree, however, was and has been very valuable because it maps onto the tree that existed prior to evolution, namely the Linnaean classificatory tree. As both Darwin and Haeckel recognized, zoological taxonomy produces trees. Calling creatures mammals and primates imposes a tree-like structure upon them. In other words, the idea that living species are structured in a metaphorically tree-like way came from Linnaeus, even if he never actually showed it that way, as a tree. Darwin sought and found an explanation for that tree-like pattern, and very quickly in the late 19th century, trees of classification and trees of descent came to be mutually supportive. But what's crucial here is the recognition that after 250 years of Linnaeus and scientific taxonomy, it simply doesn't apply within our species. In fact, it was killed off in the 1960s. As a younger generation of physical anthropologists was rethinking the patterns of variation in our species, two scholars published their final attempts to formally subdivide our species. One was based on classical data, the other on genetics. In the journal Nature, Bernard Campbell presented a very biologically looking formal official classification of the human species, following Linnaeus and adding the peoples of the Pacific and Australia. Shortly thereafter, William Boyd published in Science a more high-tech but less official-looking formal arrangement in which he identified 13 human races, which he clustered into 6 larger groups, which I have color-coded for your convenience. The rest of the anthropological community seems to have felt that anyone who could identify 5 kinds of Europeans and only 1 kind of Africans probably isn't looking very objectively at the human species. Whatever is or has been going on in our species is just not well represented by the metaphor of the tree. Although unfortunately some geneticists have tried, quite recently, with new technologies and old ideologies to squeeze human variation into a tree mold, and often with bizarre results. In the 1960s, some geneticists asked who was more closely related of the 3 races, Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid, to sound sciency. But of course that maps onto white, yellow, black, Europe, Asia, or Africa, and not to mention Japheth, Shem, and Ham. But by the 1980s, other geneticists were showing that the gene pool of Africans is not equivalent to the gene pool of Europeans or Asians. It subsumes them, which means that this very comparison is meaningless. For the answer you will get depends entirely on which samples you've chosen to represent those categories of people symbolically. The problem is that identifying the major taxonomic divisions in our species is a classic square peg in round hole problem. Like much in science, if you really want something to be there, you can find it. But this is a taxonomic fallacy, a false idea that the human species can be naturally divided into a reasonably small number of reasonably discrete groups, like chimpanzees can, who have strikingly different patterns of variations than humans. But knowing that this pattern was supposed to be there in people, scientists proceeded to see it for 200 years. This is a phenomenon also well known in science. Seeing what you know is supposed to be there. One of the most famous examples of this, my favorite, was the count of 48 chromosomes in human cells, which was printed in biology textbooks through the 1950s. Why? Because the leading expert had looked at pictures like this in the 1920s and counted 48, and for the next 30 years, everybody who counted human chromosomes in the microscope knew that in order to be doing it right, they had to count all 48 human chromosomes. And that was replicated in the literature for 30 years. Geneticists literally saw 48 chromosomes in human cells, even though there are only 46. Which is why the geneticists who first began to count 46 with greater technological precision in the 1950s were initially reluctant to publish because they thought they were making some kind of a mistake. 30 years of incorrectly counting 48 chromosomes in human cells is directly parallel to 200 years of incorrectly seeing human races in human biology. The false assumption from Schleicher through Darwin and Haeckel, and for another century of scientific research, is that human groups are fundamentally naturalistic units, and consequently that humans can in principle be classified as one might classify any other group of animals. That is false because we now know that humans group themselves in all kinds of ways, which have all kinds of effects upon the course of their lives, and which are sometimes correlated with biological patterns, but which are rarely themselves biological. They're cultural. And bear in mind that culture only entered the scientific literature 150 years ago, defined initially by Edward Tyler as the things acquired as a member of society. In other words, the things that are different from your biological or genetic or racial or natural inheritance. Consequently, when we talk about whether race is real, which is a very unfortunate characterization, what we really mean is what kind of reality does race have? A scholar a century ago knew that race was a fundamental feature of the human species, and that it was a fundamental feature that defined you, and that it was transmitted from parent to child, intact and undiluted. That, however, did not stand up very well against the emergence of the field of genetics. And by the time of World War II, not entirely coincidentally, the concept of race was being rethought by population geneticists. That earlier understanding of race did not actually apply to anything real in the world of biology. Now, from the 1930s through the 1960s, race was still a fundamental feature of the human species, but instead of being a tiny pearl or diamond within you, it was now a gene pool. This may not sound like much of a difference, but instead of race being something within you, it was now something that you were in. And these two views were quite compatible with one another as long as the gene pools were discrete and distinct from one another, which of course they turned out not to be, very clearly by the 1980s. Given that race is real and race is important, then what is it? One direction, representing increasing desperation, is to basically ignore 90% of genetic diversity and focus only on a small bit of the human genome that varies from place to place, and use statistics to make a probabilistic statement about the geographical ancestry of a person from the fine-grained analysis of their ordinarily invisible DNA variations. That is certainly interesting, but it's not what anyone has ever meant by race. And if that's what it takes to identify it, then the biological reality of race certainly means something quite different than the biological reality of race meant 50 or 100 years ago. Instead, today we recognize that the reality of race is not primarily natural, like the reality of a tree, but rather primarily cultural, like the reality of injustice. Of course, this idea has roots that stretch back to the anthropologist Ashley Montagu and probably beyond, but one of the nicest articulations of this is by Karen and Barbara Fields, with reference to the classic anthropological study of witchcraft in Africa. In short, witchcraft has a significant impact on people's lives, regardless of the fact that it is naturalistically false. It is socially and cognitively true, and that fact manages to call it into existence in the lives of people, in spite of it not being part of the natural world. As famously analyzed by the British anthropologist Evans Pritchard decades ago, African witchcraft has no existence in the natural world, but the belief in witchcraft, and specifically the belief in witchcraft as an antisocial force, imbues it with a reality in people's lives that overrides the fact that it doesn't exist in nature. Collective human minds essentially call it into existence as a force that affects and structures people's lives. Not a force like gravity, but a force like law-abidingness or justice or love. Things that don't exist in the world of nature, but are nevertheless quite real in human lives. Likewise with race. And an important consequence of seeing race as a fact of symbolic culture rather than as a fact of material nature, is that it forces us to confront the cultural world that we inhabit, and in particular to confront the assumptions we hold about it. It is not that race is unreal, as we occasionally hear, but that race is unreal as a fact of nature. At issue is not whether race is real, but the kind of reality that race is. It's not like the reality of a rock or a flower. It's like the reality of injustice, or the reality of an insult, or the reality of dollars, all of which can have naturalistic consequences without themselves being facts of nature. After all, if we maintain, as one occasionally hears, that the natural realm is all that there is, and consequently, if race doesn't exist as a natural unit, then it doesn't exist at all, that creates a world in which there is no injustice. For injustice only exists in relation to a moral or legal code, which is not a feature of the natural or material world, but only of the specifically human symbolic cultural world. A world without injustice is, of course, a world without accountability. And that is most decidedly not a non-political world. In fact, it's a highly reactionary political world. Today we can talk about the actual patterns of human variation and observe trivially that the primary way that human populations differ from one another is cultural. Darwin and Haeckel couldn't even think about it that way because culture wasn't invented as an analytical scientific concept distinct from nature or biology or genetics or race until Tyler in 1871. Now, of course, it's obvious. And that was a big discovery of 19th century anthropology. The principal patterns by which human groups differ from one another is culturally. Human variation is primarily cultural variation. But suppose, for some perverse reason, you decide that you want to ignore culture and focus only on physical variation in our species. What would you find? Well, you would find that it's not so easy to separate biology and culture because pretty much any feature of the human body receives input from both. Franz Boas famously showed over 100 years ago that skull shape and more generally body form are very sensitive to the conditions of life. Today we talk about developmental plasticity. Decades ago we were calling it adaptability. The point is that human bodies are biocultural objects that are not formed in a vacuum. And if you think that cultural features are just superficial aspects of human diversity to be ignored in favor of biological features, that encodes a paradox. Since the most obvious set of biological features, the body, is not sealed off from cultural input. In the 21st century, we know that the cultural input can arise from changes to the DNA in dividing cells in growing tissues that do not affect the nucleotide sequence of the DNA, but rather affect the packaging of the DNA and thus its expression, and are stably transmitted to daughter cells. We call this not genetic, but epigenetic. So you say, okay, forget about culture and forget about bodies. I want to focus on the deep structure of the human species by examining only their gene pools. Culture only confuses things, and bodies only confuse things. What pattern do I find if I ignore the two major patterns of human variation and focus only on the gene pool? Well, you find that genetic variation is primarily polymorphic or cosmopolitan. Nearly all variations are found nearly everywhere, but merely in different proportions, like the blood groups. This is a cartoon from World War II, showing that if you need blood, matching the blood type is far more important than matching the race. Blood type A can come from anyone of any complexion, because it's found among people of all complexions. But is the variation in blood type, with nearly everything being found nearly everywhere but in slightly different proportions, is that the exception or the rule in the human gene pool? That piece of the puzzle was solved first by the geneticist Richard Lewontin in the early 1970s. He showed that there was at least 7 times more genetic variation detectable within human groups than between human groups. And that result has turned out to be remarkably robust, regardless of what measurement of genetic variation you use: proteins, mitochondrial DNA, nuclear DNA. Most genetic variants are found in most populations, differing only in their proportions. Now let's say that you decide to ignore the 3 major patterns of human variation: the cultural, the developmental, the cosmopolitan, and decide to focus only on that small proportion of specifically DNA variation that differs from group to group. What do you find? You find that human populations are genetically similar to those nearby and different from those far away. Human populations differ gradually over geography, a pattern we call clinal. And that is why the newest, highest tech data on human variation is generally presented in the oldest, lowest tech way, as pie charts, because that presentation describes the pattern best. And now, at last, you decide to ignore the 4 major patterns of variation in human populations. You ignore cultural variation, you ignore developmental bodily variation, you ignore polymorphic genetic variation, and you ignore clinal genetic variation. What is left? The answer is local variation. Local could mean large, like the malarial belt across Central Africa, Southern Europe, and Southern Asia, which has had a striking effect on the gene pools of all of those peoples, most famously in the microevolutionary adaptation of sickle cell anemia. Or local could mean small populations, restricted in size, in space, or time. Indigenously, people who look like this come from a very small part of the world, in this case, Scandinavia. And this is where ancestry may come into play for health risks. But ancestry doesn't map onto race. After all, any group of people with an identity has a gene pool that is shaped by who is included in the group and their particular demographic history. And that is why all human groups have their own particular health risks in their gene pools. Certainly, having sub-Saharan African ancestry elevates your risk of sickle cell anemia. But you're also not out of the woods if you're from the Eastern Mediterranean, Saudi Arabia, or India. Alpha thalassemia seems to have a physiological effect on East Asians similar to that of sickle cell anemia, and is elevated in frequency by natural selection. We really don't know why Northern Europeans are at highest risk of cystic fibrosis than the rest of the world, and the rest of the world is at higher risk of lactose intolerance, but there is quite an extensive literature on why that might be the case. Founder effect is the reason that the gene pool of the Pennsylvania Amish has more Ellis Van Creveld syndrome than the rest of the world. Tay-Sachs disease presents a higher risk with Eastern European Jewish ancestry, but also with Cajun and French Canadian ancestries. White Africans, white South Africans of Dutch ancestry are at a higher risk for variegated porphyria because of founder effect. And the mixed ancestry communities in South Africa are at the second highest risk because of gene flow from them. And Hopis of Arizona are at higher risk for albinism because of the cultural practice of regarding albino as not fit for outdoor men's work, and consequently leaving albino men at home with the women for centuries. My point, though, is that although human gene pools are indeed shaped by ancestry, they differ only subtly from one another. But more significantly, none of these gene pools corresponds to something someone would formally consider a race. The only way to see discrete branches of the human lineage is to impose them on the human lineage, which in turn makes them seem real enough. Above the species level, a tree of divergences and a tree of named units can often profitably be mapped onto one another, because although we now know it to be a bit of an oversimplification, that is what species do after their gene pools stop being in contact with each other. They diverge. But below the species level, of course, humans are a network rather than a bifurcating tree. That discovery took much of the latter part of the 20th century to appreciate. But to bring us up to the present day, we no longer understand the human species as Linnaeus did, nor as any of his intellectual successors did. I think the best description of our species geneticists are starting to use now is a structured metapopulation. Structured, meaning there are all kinds of complicated clusters of people defined in diverse ways within our species. And metapopulation, because there are also complicated patterns of historical contact among these groups of people. And so we are at the point where we have come to understand that human variation and race are separate things. If we are studying race, then we are studying systems of classification and oppression, cultural ideas and processes. If we're studying human variation, we are looking at actual patterns of difference in our species, this structured metapopulations, with much less genetic diversity and differently distributed than in chimpanzees. And we can study that to a large extent naturalistically. Now, how much time do I have? All right. I got about 15 minutes more. Okay, but this will take us in a slightly different direction. So I'd like to wind down with an extension of these ideas to the work of our colleagues in the neighboring field of paleoanthropology, who are also busy classifying. And I want to suggest that we can apply these insights acquired in anthropology over the last half century or so to another seemingly intractable problem, paleotaxonomy. In other words, let's apply what we've learned from the study of human variation to the study of human ancestry. Classically, we imagine macroevolution above the species level as invariably a branching pattern, and microevolution below the species level as at least possibly connected by gene flow. We recognize our species is not taxonomically structured at present. But naturalistically, perhaps it is a structured metapopulation without real biological distinctions all the way down. That might go some way to explaining why the taxonomy of the genus Homo today is as unsettled as the taxonomy of the species Homo sapiens was a few generations ago. The problem in paleoanthropology is an old one, and is expressed nicely in this book review from a few years ago by the distinguished Berkeley paleoanthropologist Tim White. He's reviewing a book discussing the 22 species in the human lineage. Just in the genus Homo, the book had this list. And White explains, this is all part of hominid diversity systematics run amok. Many of the putative species are chronotaxa, others are not even valid species in that sense. Chronotaxa, by the way, are two species at either end of a lineage, so that one is the early version and one is a later version, and they start off as one species and end up as another, even though it's really one lineage. No one really thinks, continues White, that the available hominid species represent 22 separate species lineages in the last 6 million years. Well, maybe the author of that book did, but that's not our problem. Our problem is how many species are there or were there in, and let's just restrict ourselves to our own genus. How many species were there in the genus Homo? This book gives 12. Presumably, Tim White thought that was too many. But the important thing is this. In biology, a lineage or clade is composed of species. Those are its elementary units. Your job as a paleoanthropologist is to determine how many and what they are. Does that sound familiar? This assumes that our fossil record is divisible into natural units, species, and that all it takes is a competent, objective scientific analysis to identify them. Except, of course, that if such an analysis existed, we would presumably all agree on it, and we don't. Instead, we divide our colleagues into lumpers and splitters. Some of them lump fossils with diverse anatomies into a few species. They interpret anatomical diversity as being due to sex and age and geography, and they tell a story about the cohesion and persistence of our lineage. Others split the fossils into a lot of species, interpreting the anatomical diversity as principally taxonomic, and they tell a story about diversity and extinction. Obviously, these are quite different stories, and the true scholar is in the middle, with a taxonomy that is just right, like the baby bear's porridge in the children's story of Goldilocks. The problem, of course, is that everybody thinks that they are the baby bear, and that their taxonomy of the genus Homo is the one that's right. Moreover, we all know that anyone who is familiar with the data actually knows that there is something a bit wrong with actually seeing this one or that one as a real species. As a trivial example, this science bestseller from a few years ago by the Israeli historian Yuval Harari names 6 species on its back cover. Okay. Homo sapiens, hard to argue with, okay. Homo neanderthalensis, definitely 30 years ago when we thought there was no gene flow between them, but now we're not so sure. Homo erectus, hard to argue with, although not at 100,000 years ago. It was extinct by then, that's another issue. Homo floresiensis, an interesting fossil from Indonesia. But Homo denisova, that actually has not been formally named by anyone, because it is only accessible to geneticists, who initially found unfamiliar DNA in a Siberian finger bone about 10 years ago. But even they say that the DNA comes from a side branch of Neanderthals. There is no such thing as Homo denisova. And finally, Homo soloensis, named for some other Indonesian fossils, which are sort of anatomically intermediate between Homo erectus and Homo sapiens, but nobody calls them Homo soloensis. That species didn't even make it onto the list that Tim White was criticizing. Homo soloensis is not real as a fact of nature. The anatomy is real, the bones are real, but the species Homo soloensis is a place saver for part of the human lineage connected in space and time to other human lineages. In that sense, then, the name Homo soloensis is a fictive ancestor. It isn't part of the material, biological, natural world. It's part of what Claude Lévi-Strauss called the bricolage, the raw narrative elements out of which we construct scientific origin myths of our species. That is what all of these names represent. Not elements of biological history, but elements of stories about biological history. They're attempts to create formal biological distinctions where there are, in fact, no such formal biological distinctions in nature. Again, perhaps this sounds familiar. So I'd suggest that the problem with paleoanthropological taxonomy today is the same problem with racial taxonomy decades ago. A fundamental confusion of categories, mistaking units of symbolic culture for units of biological nature. In this case, we're trying to study our ancestors scientifically. Yet it's a truism in anthropology that the ancestors are always sacred. Many people actually worship their ancestors. Scientists are certainly not immune. Just a few months ago, biological anthropology was racked by a scandal when some of our sacred relics, notably the finger bone of Homo naledi, were shot up into outer space as a publicity gimmick for South African science. Fortunately, they came back. But the outcry from the paleoanthropological community was as if the Vatican had arranged to shoot the Shroud of Turin into outer space. Our fossil ancestors are sacred relics, and their names are invested with power. So are their namers. There are personal, professional, and national benefits that accrue to finding the first member of a new species, and nothing comparable comes to you if you find the second member of a species we already knew about. Consequently, to treat hominin species as if they were fruit fly species, or as if they were any kind of more or less value-neutral biological objects, is to misunderstand their nature completely. We have learned to talk about human variation without formal biological taxonomy. The groups that compose our species are created for particular purposes. And while they may correlate with some biological patterns, they don't represent natural divisions. We should probably also learn to talk about human ancestry that way too. So I will end there, and thank you all for your time and perseverance.
Wow. Muchísimas gracias, John. Fue una fantástica charla. Yo creo que todos estaremos de acuerdo en ello. Y pues mi papel es principalmente moderar la sesión en términos de las preguntas que puedan existir ahorita. Especialmente nos vamos a concentrar primero en quienes nos acompañan hoy. Si alguien tiene alguna pregunta, comentario, observación, reflexión sobre los chistes que hizo John también, que fueron buenísimos. También es algo que siempre disfrutamos mucho de los textos que él ha escrito. Creo que Brian tiene una pregunta. Entonces, pues vamos a empezar así, con preguntas del público, después tal vez algunas de la sesión de YouTube y a lo mejor yo también, si se puede, unas cuantas más. Gracias. ¿Sí?
Okay.
Claro, sí.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much. Interesting and amazing talk. Really amazing. You just said what I always want to say, and obviously I can't because I am not Jonathan Marks, right? I really love the part of biology. I am biologist, and I really love the part of Linneo and Haeckel and that stuff. My question is, is more about, or my opinion is about the. I wrote my question. Recently, during research for my PhD, some academics told me that although racist has racist consequences, it is necessary for biological studies, specifically for biomedical studies. I don't believe human races exist. But based on your experience, how can we tell these scholars that human races for scientific study are not really necessary?
Well, I think Alan Goodman is going to address this tomorrow a bit. But generally speaking, we are going to, if we're going to try and address disparities in healthcare that are caused by racism, then we have to use race as the analytic character in order to make that better. But that doesn't necessarily mean that race is a naturalistic category, which was again what I was getting at. Any group of people is going to have their own health risks, and there's a problem now in the UK, in England, where generations of cousin marriages from immigrants from the Near East are coming up with a lot of genetic problems because of cousin marriage for generations. And the people who aren't members of that ethnic group are going, why should we have to pay for it? But the answer is, you people have your own genetic problems as well. It all evens out. Every group of people has their own health risks. So if those health risks are partitioned by whatever categories of self-identification are being used, then you have to use those categories in order to make them more equitable. But that is, I would say that's probably the only reason to use race, is to rectify problems that are caused by racism. De nada.
¿Alguien más?
Hi, I have a question. How is the utility to keeping discuss race in social science, and what is the value of discuss about race in social science? Because in some points, or in some moments when you talk about race, you're awkward and you don't talk about that because it's uncomfortable for other people. Even in social science, when we talk about race, but right now we don't discuss that because you look like everything is racism and things like that. So my question is about the utility of race in social science.
Well, whenever I talk about race, I start off by defining it so that people know, so that we're all on the same page. And one of the things that I actually appreciated from talking to some Argentinian anthropologists a couple of weeks ago is that there are huge problems of definition and translation. Just within English, race can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I'm pretty sure that it doesn't translate well to raza in Argentinian Spanish, and I'm pretty sure it doesn't translate well to raza in Mexican Spanish. And so I think before any conversation about race can take place, we start by saying, what do we mean by this word? Because the connotations just in English, much less across languages, will only drive us crazy if we try and have a conversation about it.
Gracias.
Juan. También les quiero recordar, si gustan presentarse para que sepamos un poco más desde dónde viene la pregunta.
Juan
Eso
Manuel
siempre ayuda.
Okay, I am Juan Manuel Arguelles, an anthropologist. An anthropologist. Thank you for your talk. It was wonderful. You're amazing. I will do this in Spanish because I need to be very clear. Mucho todo lo que has dicho, pero sucede con el problema de las razas, justamente. Las razas no existen, no existen las diferencias, son inocuas, no hay por qué hablar de ello, pero luego suceden cosas con respecto de ello.
The translator just asked, it said the microphone isn't working.
I can do it in English if you...
Okay.
No.
Claro, sí.
Okay. It was easy to do it thank you. Te comentaba que muchas veces se ha discutido mucho la prueba de Lewontin de la variabilidad, y entonces se ha llegado a la conclusión, en realidad no hay una diferencia morfológica o una diferencia genética, y no hay por qué seguir hablando de razas, pero luego resulta que sí, que hay que seguir hablando porque hay problemas sociales fuertes. Y lo pensaba por la genética, Jonathan, porque justamente cuando comentas, hay un mínimo de genes que es una cosa prácticamente pequeña, de la que no vale la pena hablar, y lo decimos siempre cuando hablamos de ello, pero entonces parece ser que ese mínimo de variabilidad es inocuo o es muy pequeño. Y entonces en México, por ejemplo, que tenemos muchos problemas con Estados Unidos, con Europa, con Canadá, con respecto del acecho para llevarse muestras genéticas, justamente cuando uno aquí comenta, veo un problema con la data, dicen, la data es la mínima del ser humano, no se puede hacer nada que pudiera representar ningún problema para los demás, porque es una pequeña parte del genoma humano. No vemos ningún problema en tener nosotros un biobanco con todos los datos genéticos de los mexicanos. ¿En función de qué? ¿Por qué tendría que temer a alguien de una porción tan pequeña del genoma? Y a mí eso me preocupa un poco. No sé la respuesta, pero me ha inquietado durante muchos años. Trabajé como director de un acervo teológico de restos humanos aquí, que tiene más de 7 toneladas de restos humanos, y en el museo, sí, yo trabajo en el Museo de Antropología, y pues yo veo que hay un entusiasmo muy grande de llevarse una porción genética que a la vez les parece tan inocua y pequeña. No sé tú qué opines de este problema. Muchísimas gracias por tu conferencia. Por eso lo quería decir en español. Thank you very much.
Do I understand correctly, you're talking about taking genetic samples from bones and doing ancient DNA work on them?
There's a lot of people who take samples here, and they always said, it's a tiny kind of,
Don't worry, no te preocupas. I just heard a story again a couple of weeks ago that there are some fossils in Eastern Europe that were literally destroyed by geneticists saying, oh, we'll just take a little bit and look at the DNA. So it's a destructive procedure. The question, I think, is what information, how valuable is the information you're going to get out of it?
Because the argument is it's a little bit, not important. It's the argument of
Well, but we know of examples where the geneticists have destroyed the specimens. So if they say tomorrow, oh, don't worry, we know that maybe that's true and maybe it's not true. I think the question is, what are we hoping to learn from the study of ancient DNA? And a lot of genomics today, unfortunately, is answers looking for questions. So for example, there was a big story a couple of weeks ago about studying the gene pool of Mexico. Why not? Sure. But why? Right? So there are sort of, I can think of two things that might come of it. One is the study of ancestry and giving individual people some notes about their ancestry. We know that that information is being used badly in China towards certain ethnic minorities in China already, the Uyghurs. So yeah, that comes with a price tag. And the other advantage might be that we can look at genetic susceptibilities to genetic diseases. But the fact is that, genetic diseases are tragic, but they're a small part of the health disparities that exist across populations in Mexico or the United States or anywhere. So why you would want to devote all of you or so much of your resources to remember also, we can't cure genetic diseases. We're a lot better at just noting that they're there. So that's a large expenditure on a very small part of healthcare. But we have the technology and we can do it, and people are probably going to make money off it because we'll charge people for their ancestry tests. Just to free associate for a second, 30 years ago, I was talking to some Native Americans about the idea of collecting their DNA. The geneticist Cavalli Sforza wanted to collect DNA from all the indigenous people. And my Native American friends were very reluctant. They said, some way or another, first of all, they're going to build gene bombs to try and destroy us with our DNA. And again, that's going on in China today. And two, the scientists are going to make money off of it, and the Indians won't see a nickel from it. And of course, DNA ancestry testing today is $1 billion industry, and the indigenous people get nothing. So yeah, there are interesting social and cultural questions about just what the costs and benefits and why bother doing any of this. I'm rambling. I don't think I've answered your question, but I have lots of friends that do ancient DNA work, and I know that they are incredibly careful, and most importantly, they work with local communities, and often they have the local communities decide what questions to ask. And that is a big reversal from the way genetics was being done on local populations 20 or 30 years ago.
I don't know. Hi, I am Alicia from Science, the Evolutionary Department at UNAM. I have a question, but I don't know if I could do it clearly. Sí. My question is, the tendency of certain diseases in some populations, could it be explained as an endogamic behavior, like in the Jews, or could it be explained as an epigenetic behavior? Like, for instance, in Mexico, they say the genome of Mexican genomes. And I would say, that's not true, no? That could be the way that they eat, But in the case of the Jews, that they have certain tendency to have some particular diseases, it could be explained as an endogamic population, or what could it be an answer?
Yes, on that slide I showed where various populations have various diseases that they're more that they're more likely to have than other populations. Endogamy, marrying your own kind, certainly elevates the possibility of rare recessive alleles coming together and getting the disease. That occurs from founder effect. That was the case in the Pennsylvania Amish with their rare disease of Ellis-Van Creveld syndrome, which the main phenotype of which is extra fingers, which is kind of cool. what I tried to do there is just say that there are all kinds of explanations in microevolution for why different diseases might be elevated in different people, and certainly endogamy plays a role in elevating those. Okay.
Gaby, por favor.
Thank you very much. I find your talk amazing, really. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias.
And I just want to ask why this very solid biological argument about the inexistence of race is not so convincing or so convincing for what you call cultural symbolic systems, state, politics, people, common sense of people, despite the prestige of the so-called hard science. Why? I am social anthropologist, and my concern is about why people use race as common sense to relate each other. So why is your opinion about that?
Well, it's there. People use it because, they sort of grew up with it. And again, my frame of reference is the United States, right? But, it has always been there, and it's our frame of reference for making sense of who our neighbors are and the kinds of people that exist. And once you know what the empty slots are, then you can start putting people into them. And so I think that my dream for the future, I don't think we will ever not classify, because I think it's human nature to classify, and I think we have to make sense out of all of the diversity of peoples we find. But the issue of racism involves ranking, involves the hierarchy of these categories. And it doesn't matter whether those categories are from nature or from religion or from any other fact of human existence that is cultural or symbolic. If they're being ranked, that's a problem.
Me parece que Olivia sigue.
Well, thank you really very, very much. It was very interesting and very funny. I really appreciate that very much. Many things I don't understand, because I am not an anthropologist and I'm a historian, and the biological discourse is difficult for me. But I wanted to, you said, when I talk about race, the first thing I do is to define what I mean by race. I would like you to do that if you can, so we can understand exactly what you mean. But it's true that it's different in different societies, no? Not only from the point of view of how it is defined, or when it started to be defined, or who defines it and who doesn't. It's true, and I think that's a very important discussion. When you were talking, I hope I understood, but when you were talking about, you made a very interesting intellectual exercise that's saying, let's imagine that we leave biology behind and we only talk about culture, and you talked about that. Now let's imagine that we leave culture behind and we only talk about biology. I think that in some countries like Mexico, we have tended to talk about culture more than to talk about biology. That does not mean that we don't discriminate people and that racism does not exist. But as what I was telling you before, people don't identify in Mexico as belonging to races. Now a little bit, Gabriel is studying the Afro-Mexicans in Mexico City, and they are starting to say we belong to the Black or Afro-descendant race. But most Afro-Mexicans don't identify as as a race. And indigenous peoples in Mexico don't identify as race. In fact, the political movement of the indigenous peoples in Mexico is saying today, don't call us indigenous. Not even from the cultural point of view or political point of view, because we belong to different peoples. And we don't want you to talk about us as a unity anymore, okay? So if you are in this context, what is the reto, ¿cómo se dice? The challenge. What is the challenge? They have told us, and this I finish because I know it's long, but I cannot do it shorter. They have told us in Mexico, our group, many times, that if we don't identify different peoples in this country, for example, as belonging to races, we are colorblind and we are race deniers. And we say, no, we're not colorblind, but race is not only about color. And we are not racism deniers, because racism exists. But we cannot accept to have people identify as races, belonging to races, because we feel that it's an imposition, something imposed from the exterior and from other societies. So how could we discuss between these societies in these issues? That's something that really worries us. I hope I have been clear. I don't know.
You've been clear. I have no clear answer for that. I think that's something that maybe over, today and tomorrow we can discuss further, because ultimately the issue in any society is going to be injustice. Somebody is getting too much, somebody's getting too little. Now, no matter how you divide that up, what is important is equality. So in some sense, it doesn't really matter whether you believe the world comes in Jewish, Christian, Muslim, or white, yellow, black, or Mexico, United States, Costa Rica. I mean, even if Mexico is not a natural unit, you can certainly study its gene pool. Now, again, that raises the question of what do you want to do with that information? And there's always the question of what is there a difference between information and knowledge? And does the collection of information necessarily lead to more knowledge? I think those are always going to be local questions. I mean, those are going to be unique to any society. It depends upon who composes the society and what injustices exist in that society. And in that case, in that case, you can talk about racism even if there is no naturalistic race. I mean, it might be better just to talk about inequality, where racism would be race-based inequality, and other kinds of inequality might be religion-based or nationality-based, well, which certainly exist in the U.S. And maybe just calling it racist confuses the issue, and we should be talking instead about patterns of inequality. That's kind of the best I can do off the top of my head at this hour.
Thank you, Professor Jonathan Marks. Maybe Francisco wants to make an intervention so you can chill a little bit, relax, take a break, and then maybe if you have another questions, let us know, and we'll keep it talking. Una pregunta ahí. La tomamos y luego...
Déjenme hacer esta pequeña intervención. Les prometo que no será muy larga y después nos concentramos en la pregunta de nuestro colega. Creo que sí es muy interesante cómo después de la presentación tan compleja y también tan buena, tan brillante, ya llegamos a uno de los puntos que están detrás de la intención profunda, original de este encuentro académico, que es pensar la relación Estados Unidos-México alrededor del tema complejísimo de raza y racismo, ¿no? Ya salieron varias pedazos de información acerca de las diferencias sociales, culturales, históricas, de cómo se utiliza la palabra raza misma, viendo también que hay heterogeneidades inclusive dentro de los países angloparlantes, y en particular Estados Unidos y México y otros países latinoamericanos no son la excepción. Yo quisiera poner una primera capa de complejidad adicional, que es la que tiene que ver con un aspecto que ya fue tocado por John en varias ocasiones, sobre todo ahorita al final, que ya empezó a hablar de la genómica y de los usos del poder alrededor de esa investigación científica. Esta capa de complejidad que quiero incorporar aquí es que hay una, por decirle de alguna manera, economía política de la biología molecular y de estas nuevas biociencias, ¿verdad? ¿Quién fabrica los secuenciadores que están detrás de los proyectos? O sea, ¿qué compañías están algunas de ellas basadas en Estados Unidos o en Europa y que le venden justamente estas mercancías a países latinoamericanos, ¿no? ¿Cómo esto está vinculado con este discurso acerca de que en relación a esta investigación sobre el biobanco mexicano que John ya refirió, hay una especie de desigualdad en el muestreo en Latinoamérica? Esto es una especie de injusticia y entonces hay que sustituir esta injusticia por hacer más trabajo de secuenciación en estas poblaciones dejadas un poco a un lado, ¿no? Porque los primeros proyectos de genoma humano pues eran en Estados Unidos y en Europa precisamente. Entonces, esta vinculación de discursos sociales, culturales, de la diferencia, de diferenciales de poder, pero también el asunto de la relación entre capitalismo y ciencia, en un par de naciones que están tan vinculadas comercialmente, del modo en que lo están, por nuestra gigantesca frontera, por los procesos migratorios, creo que ese es también hacia donde podríamos empezar a vislumbrar que puede dirigirse esta conversación. Nada más quiero poner eso sobre la mesa, ¿no? Y apenas empezamos, mañana todavía le va a tocar a Alan tocar algunos asuntos que van a complementar esto y a Yolanda también para el cierre, y yo esperaría que, como lo hemos estado planeando ya durante algunos años, esto sea pues otro episodio más en este acercamiento de estas comunidades académicas haciendo investigación interdisciplinaria sobre este problema tan interesante y al mismo tiempo con consecuencias tan fuertes para ambas sociedades, ¿no? La sociedad de los Estados Unidos y la nuestra aquí en México. Por favor, si gustas presentarte también, sería muy bueno.
Hola, buenas noches. Mi nombre es Alejandro Guerrero. Yo soy licenciado y maestro en filosofía por la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras de aquí de la UNAM. Y aquí en la Torre 2 pertenezco al CEIICH, al Centro de Estudios México-Brasil. Y bueno, me pareció muy interesante y pertinente esa mención al concepto de brujería en términos de lo racial, en una perspectiva de un paradigma crítico, porque precisamente en el CIALC, en la Conferencia Latinoamericana de Ciencias Sociales que tuvo lugar el año pasado aquí en la UNAM, Claxo, expusimos un tema referente a un autor haitiano, Jacques Romain, que tiene en su novela fundamental, Los gobernantes de Rocío, a un personaje que lo que hace es cazar de alguna manera de forma ideológica para emancipar a los zombies negros que están representados por los colonialistas, por el hegemón que explota a nivel laboral al resto de los personajes, digamos al común de la población de la isla, tipificándolos como los zombies esclavos que no tienen derecho, emancipación. Y este novelista lo que hace es jugar con la ambivalencia que se le da a la brujería o al color de la práctica chista, digamos, ¿no? de toda esta tradición de la vertiente africana, la yoruba, el vudú, Costa de Marfil, Congo, y extrapolar los valores y convertir este concepto de raza en un carácter de cariz, de tamiz, de factor de configuración de una comunidad. Entonces, bueno, lo comento porque me parece que abriendo el diálogo hay una constante negación a caer en la pregunta una vez más de por qué en la UNAM, y lo abro, ¿no? Tenemos el lema que está en todos los papeles, en todos los escudos de la universidad, en todos los oficios, en todo carácter de todo instituto, facultad, escuela preparatoria y CCH, que es el lema: por mi raza hablará el espíritu. Eso, exactamente. José Vasconcelos, que además es un autor mexicano, yéndonos un poquito a la filosofía, si se le puede llamar así, ¿no? Filosofía mexicana, que en la UNAM específicamente está principalmente dirigida al carácter ontológico y no materialista, que fue una discusión a nivel político hace un siglo, pero La raza cósmica es un texto de José Vasconcelos mexicano y define, pues, aunque creo que lo hemos apropiado como generaciones posteriores a las luchas estudiantiles, a las luchas sindicales, a los distintos contextos políticos y diferentes también momentos represivos cíclicos en México, de ubicar a la raza como una comunidad, es deficiencia profesional, filosófica, a la raza vista casi en una analogía heideggeriana a lo que sería el pueblo, es decir, a una comunidad trascendente, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, esa reflexión respecto a por mi raza hablará el espíritu, ¿qué querría decir hoy en un contexto como este, de la no racialización, del antirracismo, y también pues esa forma de agradecer el tocar el tema de la brujería, porque me parece que dentro de lo que implica la biología, también vista de un modo interseccional, pues también la biología, la geopolítica y el factor que implican a estas alturas, digamos, las constantes que hay con el arte, con los binomios arte-resistencia, con las resistencias culturales, ver en retrospectiva con autores latinoamericanos o con autores de Latinoamérica y el Caribe, confrontándolo con todo este esquema, ¿no?, que aparece al final, es muy interesante. Gracias por la ironía, gracias por el humor y gracias por la crítica tan fina en su conferencia, doctor.
Tal vez una explicación mexicana del lema tal vez nos ayude a discutirlo mejor, sí, porque se local para...
Sí. Sí, John, would you like to
Actually,
react
you know,
to the last?
I am just learning about race in Mexico and especially the issues at UNAM. So I'm here to listen more than to talk about that.
De hecho, yo creo que eso es lo que también necesitamos, ¿no? Entendernos mejor, más a profundidad lo que pasa allá y acá. A veces tenemos muchos estereotipos que lo que hacen más bien es ocultar las complejas realidades alrededor de estos temas que hay en ambos países. Entonces, también por el asunto del tiempo empezamos un poco tarde. Yo creo que si no tienen inconveniente, que vayamos cerrando esta sesión de hoy, la primera del coloquio, y pues agradeciendo otra vez. Ahora voy a empezar por Jimena. ¿Hay una última pregunta? Ok, entonces cerraríamos con esa pregunta y ya vamos. ¿Y Alan? Ok, sí. Bueno, Alan, por supuesto va a ser nuestro ponente mañana, entonces por supuesto lo queremos escuchar hoy. Entonces, si se pueden...
¿Está
sí,
prendido?
Sí. Nada más dinos tu nombre y...
Hi. Yes, I am Mario Bella. I'm a biological anthropologist also, and I also study biology as a second career. And my question is related to what my peers say about race and social science, specifically about biological anthropology. What can we do about the increasingly entanglement of politics and the so-called race science, specifically the hereditarian aspects of biology, personality, and intelligence? Because there is an increasingly number of people who are publishing about this. and who try to legitimize race into hierarchies and categories that, from my point of view, it is an insidious part of science that.
Is that going on now in the Mexican scientific literature?
In some parts.
Oh,
but I saw that in the U.S. because there is.
Well, in the U.S., it's a diminishing group of they're getting shriller, but mostly they're located in psychology departments, which is just very
and
strange.
there are journals dedicated to that.
Yes, yes. What can we do about it? Oh, I don't know. First of all, I think we have to recognize that race is not extractable scientifically from politics. Race is political science, and that doesn't invalidate it in any way. But you have to be able to talk about it knowing what it is. And when somebody says, "Oh, let's just disentangle the biology, just talk about the biology," that's insane. You can't talk about the biology without talking about the history of colonialism or slavery or all these other historical processes. Yolanda, are you going to talk about the category Hispanic in the U.S. Census? Is that in your?
To a certain extent, but that would be another whole lecture.
but I mean the
We are open to it.
But yes,
someday.
I'm going to talk about. Yes.
Okay.
And how these biological.
So we can.
Oh.
I mean, it's really interesting how I remember a time when biological anthropologists stopped talking about race when I was a graduate student because it was uncomfortable, because they didn't want to understand the relationship between those categories and social issues and historical issues. They just want to talk about the science, right? And they're inexorably connected. And what I will be talking about tomorrow is how the state, at various levels, use that knowledge to help create something we can't get rid of today. But it happened, and they used science to do it. So if scientists don't understand how their work is being used and can be used by the state, the critique is not going to reach the people it should reach. And it's part of the reason, and I'm cutting into my talk tomorrow, but it's part of the reason that people in political power are so upset with what we're doing in the university, because we're giving students the tools to push back on that information, which makes no sense except from a political and a power perspective. So, to be continued.
This better be an easy question.
Well, it isn't even
you're
a
up
question,
tomorrow.
it's a comment.
Okay.
But I could never ask you a question. It's, yeah, I've been thinking, I guess, about Olivia's provocation about, how we're talking about translates to Mexico. And I don't have any answers, but I was going to at least suggest a framework that I'm thinking a bit about. In the United States, there been a debate about whether or not race created racism or racism created race. And I think, we've come, for instance, we used to think that we had this idea of racism, then racism evolved from that. And then a lot of people said, well, racism in the form of colonization and slavery was what made the concept of race necessary. So then scientists, Linnaeus onward, created the concept of race. And, and in reality, it's probably a dialectic or it's a synergetic relationship that one reinforces the other. In States, we see this all so clearly. The idea of race as separate and unequal is very, very clear. The idea of racism, the notion, the reality of racism in different in healthcare and life expectancy and wealth is very, very clear. And we can see that relationship so, so clearly. It's like big arrows pointing from one way to the other. In Mexico, one seems a little bit more fuzzy and kind of implicated, and you know that it's because yes, you haven't grown up with this concept of race like we have, and you know it's not generally accepted. So I'm just sort of, you know, that's at least my lens of thinking why in the United States, you know, we're absolutely clear about how racism and race relate, and that probably to get rid of racism, we have to reform, rethink how we think about race.
Yes, absolutely. But, you know, there's also, you know, when we're assuming racism is bad because we're assuming inequality is bad. And there are people who think inequality is good. So there may be a prior question that we need to settle before we start settling the questions of racism.
Bueno, Jimena, ¿quieres terminar tú? Bueno, perfecto. Bueno, entonces, muchísimas gracias, John. Para mí en particular ha sido como un sueño hecho realidad estar aquí junto a ti. Te he leído muchos años, conozco a mucha gente en México que te ha leído, eres más famoso de lo que crees aquí entre nosotros en las comunidades de antropología biológica y estas discusiones. Y pues apenas es el inicio, los invitamos para que sigan por favor el evento mañana. Tenemos 2 sesiones, una por la mañana y una por la tarde, como está en el programa, y pues continuemos la discusión. Gracias, Jimena, por todo, y pues a todas las personas que hemos estado hoy aquí, buenas noches, hasta mañana.
Nos pueden hacer llegar sus preguntas porque la idea sí es conectar las charlas y estar como atando algunos puntos. Entonces, si hay preguntas, las podemos retomar mañana con mucho gusto. Y les esperamos en el MUCA, es el auditorio que está al lado de la Facultad de Arquitectura, para escuchar a Alan Goodman a las 11 y luego de vuelta aquí en el CEIICH a las 4 de la tarde para escuchar a Yolanda Moses. Entonces, pues muchísimas gracias por su asistencia, a todos quienes están aquí, sobre todo al profesor Jonathan Marks, fue fantástico y vamos a seguir conversando. Muchas gracias también, Francisco, por tus comentarios y moderación. Entonces, nos seguimos mañana.